it is so nice to meet you, and thank you for joining me today. I'm really excited to talk about your latest novel.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. This is the fun part of the job. This is the part where I don't know, get to go out in public, as it were, and enjoy the company of others. So I'm glad to do it.
Oh, great. Well, I like to start all of my author interviews with a few signature questions, sort of get to know you questions. They're a mixture of like this or that questions, first thing that comes to mind sort of thing.
Okay. Fun.
Author you draw inspiration from?
Agatha Christie.
Favorite place to read a book?
That chair right there.
Book character you'd be best friends with?
Nancy Wake.
Oh, pen and paper or computer?
Both. I take notes on pen and paper. I work on computer.
Your favorite decade in fashion history?
Oh, excellent question. I would say 1920s.
Do you have a signature drink?
Old fashioned.
Because of your novel, Codename Hélène, favorite red lipstick?
Oh gosh, at the moment it's Glossier's Zip, but I also love Ruby Woo in MAC if I'm really going for a bright lip.
Everyone will have to read the book to understand why that's relevant. So diving into the book, would you give us your synopsis?
Yeah, absolutely. Codename Hélène is the fictionalized story of a woman named Nancy Wake. I'd never heard of her until, 5 or 6 years ago. She was a young Australian expat living in France right at the outbreak of World War II. She'd been on her own for a number of years, and when the story starts, she had just sort of conned her way into a freelance reporting job for Hearst newspapers. And as the war is brewing, she meets this man named Henri Fiacca. They fall in love, and no sooner do they get married than the Germans invade France. And Nancy was left with this decision of stand up and do something or pretend she saw nothing. And Nancy was not the kind of woman to stand aside and do nothing when the world was falling apart. So she began smuggling people and documents from one end of France to another, many of them Jewish men, women, and children that she would smuggle out of the country. And she became so good at this job that the Gestapo nicknamed her the White Mouse, and they put a 5 million franc price on her head. She was the most wanted person throughout World War II in any theater. And she was left with the decision she could escape herself or more than likely stay and be executed. So as she'd done for many other people, Nancy snuck out of the country. She went straight to England, straight to the Special Operations Executive, joined them, trained as a spy, and was flown back into France and dropped behind enemy lines, where she eventually led over 7,000 French resistance soldiers into battle.
So this book has interweaving timelines and is organized around the 4 code names of the central character, Nancy Wake, the code names that she used during the war. So as a reader, it almost felt like 4 different perspectives, and I sometimes had to remind myself that it was the same character. It's hard to believe that she did all of this. So why organize it this way? And did you consider or try any alternatives before settling on this method?
Great question. And it's actually one that I get asked a lot. All of my stories are built around a very specific structure. And I do that because I'm trying to find the best way to tell the story in front of me. And with this particular story, it began with sort of 2 revelations as I was researching the novel. The first was that Nancy, as a very young journalist, one of her first assignments was to go to Germany and interview a man named Adolf Hitler. He had just been made German chancellor. But fast forward 8 years, you have a woman in France working with the French resistance who kills a Nazi with her bare hands. And I wanted to know how she went from being the young, naive journalist interviewing a man who you could argue becomes the most infamous person in world history to killing a man with her bare hands. And to me, the best way to do that was to alternate back and forth. The story begins with Nancy as she's on that plane about to jump out of it into the forest. And the next chapter, we alternate back 8 years. It's one to the other. It's Nancy at war, Nancy in the past, Nancy at war, Nancy in the past. And the code names are for sections of the novel. And we alternate back and forth so that you can see how this young woman becomes a warrior. I was absolutely fascinated by that transformation. I wonder what it would be like for me had I been in that situation. And I wanted to see it play out on the page. And so to me, that was the thing that made the most sense. You can see her in action, and then you see how she became that person.
Do you remember the first time you learned about Nancy Wake? And I ask this because I read a bit about this in your author note, and I loved the story so much I wanted to know more.
Yes, I know exactly when and where I was. I don't know the date, but it was October of 2015. I was in Buffalo, New York, waiting for an event. And I got an email from the mother of an old friend of mine. Her name is Sally Burgess. She's known me since I was 16 years old. Her daughter is my oldest friend. And Sally sent me sort of this real bossy email. And she said, Ariel, I don't know if you've ever heard of Nancy Wake. She's a legend down under. Sally's Australian. Nancy was Australian. She's a hero to us. She'd make the great subject for a novel. And if you don't write about her next, we can no longer be friends. Now, I mean, you can ask my mother, my own mother, how good I am at taking directions like that. So to be fair, I did not write about Nancy next because I was in the middle of writing I Was Anastasia. But as soon as I finished Anastasia, I went back to that article my friend sent me, and it was astonishing. To this day, I have never read anything like it. I've never read about a woman like Nancy Wake, a woman who went off to war and left her husband home, a woman who was admired and respected by thousands of men as a military leader. She was the kind of woman that we need to remember, and I maintain forever that she needs to be a household name.
So I'm a historian first and a reader of fiction second. So I always want to know what is fact and what is fiction. So what creative liberties did you take when writing this book?
Ooh, very few. I did a lot of condensing time frames. For instance, there's one part of the book where Nancy has to escape France and she goes over the mountains into Spain. In the book, it's one continuous attempt. In real life, it took 7 tries and close to 6 months for her to get out of the country, which is far more accurate to clandestine activities, but could very easily drag out on the page. So the majority of things that I changed had to do with compressing timelines, or if I needed her to meet specific people and she met this one year and this one 3 years later, I have her meet them at the same time. 2 characters in the book are completely fictional. Everyone else either existed or was a composite of several characters. So in a situation like this, I try not to mess with history too much. Sometimes I'm forced to. Actually, the book I'm working on now, I'm forced to more than I ever have before. But I try to stay as close to history as I possibly can.
Well, it was very clear that you did extensive research. So I want to ask you a little bit about that process. Which resources were most helpful, and did you have a favorite?
I actually have them all here. I pulled them off my shelf. So I do have a favorite. Peter Fitzsimmons, Nancy Wake was one of my primary. You can see my sticky notes and all of my notes throughout. This is why, by the way, I don't get stuff from the library, because you can't turn something like that back in. Robin Walker, The Women Who Spied for Britain, has a really fabulous chapter about Nancy. Russell Braddon's Nancy Wake, the SOE's greatest heroine, again, more. And my favorite was Nancy's autobiography that she wrote herself, The White Mouse. This one probably got battered up more than any of the others. And it's completely out of print. I had to find it online. I think it shipped from a used bookstore in London, to be honest with you. These were the 4 primary resources, but there were a few interviews on YouTube with Nancy in her older years, and they're phenomenal. If you haven't read the book, don't watch them until afterward, because there are a few spoilers, but she kept every ounce of vim and vigor that she had until her dying day. And it's delightful to watch her.
Note to self, that's what I'm doing after this interview. So I read that you tried to find the articles Nancy wrote for Hearst to no avail. Do you hold out hope that you'll find one someday, or do you think that's kind of a lost cause?
I, in my overactive imagination, I would love one day to actually get in contact with someone at Hearst who could find those articles. The deal is she wrote hundreds of them. Hearst does not make those articles available online. And after many months of digging and trying to find and emailing and calling around, I was told by a university librarian that at the time it was standard for female journalists to have their work published under their supervisor or with no name whatsoever. And to the best of my knowledge, that is what I think happened to her work because I couldn't find it, and not a single one of her biographers was able to find them either. And I emailed one, Robin Walker, and she said that she also had a great deal of difficulty finding any of those articles. So they're either lost or they are in some very dusty archive somewhere.
How do you know when you've done enough research to suffice the story, but not so much that you get lost in the rabbit hole of research and never actually sit down to write the book?
That is the never ending struggle that I have with historical fiction, partly because I really enjoy the research process. I like learning. I like filling the gaps in my education. I think everyone has them. No one gets out of school knowing everything. So we all have holes. And I love to learn. So I can absolutely go down that rabbit hole and never come out. And I tend to know when I've researched enough, when I feel like my brain can't hold anything else, which is in large part why I make all of these notes so that if it's important or if I found it interesting, I can come back to it easily and I know where to find it.
What do you hope readers gain from reading?
Reading in general, I hope they gain joy. Reading has always been my favorite form of solace and self-care. If they read mine, I want them to have joy and I want them to be entertained and I want them to learn something. And selfishly, I also hope they fall in love with these characters a little bit the way that I have with all of my novels. I have fallen in love with these people because I've spent so much time with them. They've become real to me and I want them to be remembered.
In August, you announced that Codename Hélène is coming to television as a limited series starring Elizabeth Debicki, who will also be starring as the next Princess Diana in The Crown. So what has that process been like?
It was shocking, to be honest with you. It was always one of those things that happened to other people. I do specifically remember that on publication day for Hélène, I was upstairs in the bonus room with my children. My two youngest are homeschooled due to COVID and life being crazy. And I got a text from my literary agent that said someone was interested potentially in buying the film rights. And that was the first, and that was really exciting. And then after that, it was this avalanche. And I ended up over the month of April, I was not on book tour because COVID shut the country down. So I did my book tour online, but I also spent much of the month of April talking to different producers who were interested in the book. And it was amazing. And in the end, it went down to two different companies kind of were fighting over it a little bit. And it sold to Anonymous Content, and they sent it to Elizabeth Debicki, who I did not know is actually Australian and had never heard of Nancy, but fell in love with her and felt very much like the world needs to know who this is.
Will you be involved in the television adaptation or the script writing?
No, I thought about it briefly. I was asked if I wanted to, and with my particular life, I could not find the margin. My husband and I have 4 boys, 2 in high school, 2 in middle school, and then I have a number of deadlines on my plate. And it seemed as though I would be adding more than I could possibly manage. Plus the fact that I don't actually know how to write scripts. And that is a learning curve that I'd love to solve at some point, but now is not the time.
At the beginning of this interview, I asked about your favorite place to read, but I also want to talk about your career as a writer and your writing process. So do you have a favorite place to write?
I'm sitting at it right now. It's this very small. It's about 3 feet wide and about 1.5 feet deep. It was an old school teacher's desk out of an old one-room schoolhouse that my husband found online and bought for me about 10 years ago. And it sits right here in the middle of my office. There's a little chandelier over it. And then behind me is a built-in bookshelf and second desk. And this is where I work. For some reason, I can't sit on a couch. If I'm sitting somewhere comfortable and squishy, I'm not working. I end up wasting time on the internet. It's a sad character flaw. But if I sit at this desk, in this chair, in this room, my brain goes, okay, time to work.
How did your career as an author come about? Did you always want to be an author? Did you study it, or did that come later?
Yes. No, sort of all of the above. This is honestly the only thing I've ever wanted to do. I don't know how much you know about my story, but I grew up out in the middle of nowhere, Taos, New Mexico, 20 miles from the nearest telephone, in a house with no running water, no electricity. I always joke that my parents were founding members of the hippie movement, and my life was like, I don't know, Laura Ingalls meets the hippies. So I grew up no running water, no electricity, no telephone. My mother, when I was a child, would read to us by the light of a kerosene lantern. And I was 5 years old when I decided for the first time that I didn't know what that was, but I wanted to do that. And I taught myself. I left home at 16. I was never able to go to college just based on the circumstances of my life. But I worked and I traveled across the US and then some across Europe. And I wrote and I taught myself. I also had one very, very instrumental teacher in high school. And there's this moment, well, there are two moments really that I will never forget. And I think were fundamental in me becoming a writer. The first was my freshman year. I was taking English 1, I don't know, the standard class, and I was at my locker in between classes. I was about to go from one class to another, and someone tapped me on the shoulder, and I turned around, and there was this very tall, lovely woman with silver hair. And she said, "Ariel, you don't know me, but my name is Maria Wilson, and I have heard from the other teachers in the teacher's lounge that you can write a pretty sentence. And I was wondering if you would like to take my creative writing class next year." And it was like, oh my gosh, somebody just handed me the keys to the castle. And in hindsight, I think what she saw or what she heard about in that teacher's lounge was a product of reading. My mother read to me, and then as soon as I could read to myself, I read anything and everything far above my grade level. And that will always show on the page. The more you read, the better you write. That is the one part of the process that I do think comes from osmosis, your vocabulary and your sentence structure and the way that you tell a story. You learn that by writing and reading. So following year, I took her creative writing class and I loved it, and it was fantastic. And about 3 months into the school year, she asked me to stay after class one day, and I thought, oh no, I have been fired. I've done something wrong. She's going to kick me out. And as soon as everyone else left the classroom, she said, "Ariel, we have a problem. You already know everything I'd planned on teaching the class this year. Basic structural stuff. I'm not talking about like mind-blowing stuff, just the basic things that you learn in your first creative writing class. I was already doing it." So she said, "How about we come up with a compromise? You come to class, you go to the computer lab next door, write me short stories. You write them, I'll grade them. That's your curriculum for the year." And I was like, sure, absolutely. And the funny thing is, we moved into a new house 4 or 5 years ago, and recently I was unloading boxes and I found all these stacks of paper, and in them was this story printed out on dot matrix paper with the little perforated edges and red ink. And it was the very first short story I wrote in her class. And it was a total ripoff of the Eagles song, "The Hotel California," but it was still very clever. And I flipped to the end because I remembered the last line in that story that I wrote for her was, "You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave." And my mother, Mrs. Wilson, were instrumental because they told me that I could. And I think children are so impressionable. They believe what we tell them. If you tell them you're smart and you can do it and you're good at this and I believe in you, they believe it. They also believe the opposite when you tell them. And if I'm, in a room, particularly when I talk to librarians, because there are often librarians and teachers together in a room, I always have them raise their hands and I always have people clap for them because those are hard jobs, but they change lives.
What advice would you give to an aspiring author?
The advice that I give to myself every time I sit down to work, and it is simply finish the book. There is no writing career without the finished book. There is no book tour without the finished book. There is no dream that comes true without the finished book. The finished book is the one part of the process that no one can help you with. It's the hardest part of the process because it requires consistent daily work, but it is the absolute magic. And if you have the finished book, it doesn't matter whether it's good, it doesn't matter whether it's bad, you can make it better. You can make it better, but you cannot edit a blank page.
Has your writing or research process changed since writing your first novel, The Wife, the Maid, and the Mistress?
I think the writing process is always the same. I am one of those authors. I love the revision and the editing process. I love taking the rough lump and turning it into something better. I struggle a bit more on the first draft. There's this sense of being overwhelmed. There's this huge, mountain of insecurity where you have to take nothing and turn it into something. That part is always hard for me. The research I've always enjoyed. I love piecing a story together. I am an author that plots. So I research everything. I plot out the entire story. I know where it's all going to go before I begin writing. The thing I think that has changed, however, most since my first novel is I have a sense of confidence that I can do it. When you're in the middle of your first book, there's this huge, it's like this stone around your neck. Can I do it? Am I able? Will it work? Can I do it? And then you finish that first one and you publish the first one and the answer is yes. And that answer is there from that point forward.
Have you ever abandoned a story just because it wasn't working out as a novel?
Oh, yes. If you were to look at my hard drive right now, you would see dozens of really good ideas that I either got bored with or I figured weren't that good, or just I couldn't make work or I didn't have time for. I work really well under a deadline. So if someone is expecting pages from me, my brain fires on all cylinders. Left to my own devices, I tend to not be as productive. So much of the book corpses on my computer are due to either not having a deadline or not being motivated, or in the end, not being as interested in them as I thought.
What is the most difficult, and then on the flip side, your favorite part about being an author?
Listen, this is really the best job in the world. It's the only job I've ever wanted. I love doing it. I love telling stories. I love the fact that I can do it from home in my pajamas. I did put on makeup today. That's not the norm. I love being here when my kids leave for school, and I'm here when they come home from school. I'm here to help with homework and cook meals, and I really enjoy the domestic part of my life. And this is a job that allows me to keep that in its entirety, unless I'm traveling, but that only happens at book release. The hardest thing, I think, is the vulnerability that comes with opening yourself up to the world. I don't get hate mail often, and usually I'm able to laugh it off. There have been a few that were like a kick in the teeth, and they always come on days that you're just having a hard day because of life.
Of course.
So I don't love that part, but it's okay. It's a small price to pay.
Dog lovers like me may be a little concerned at the beginning of the book when there's an introduction of a new puppy. I read that you also have dogs or had dogs, so you love dogs too. Can you assure us the dog makes it to the end?
Well, there
No.
are technically two dogs in the story. I can promise you that for the most part concerning the dogs, there is a happy ending and the main dog, totally fine. And yes, I do love dogs. We had a black lab up until this March. She passed away. She was 13 years old. Her name was Maggie. We got her when I was pregnant with my youngest son. She walked up to the door and she adopted us.
So what is next for you? Can you tell us a little bit about your next project?
Yes. So I'm looking at the wall behind my computer. That's why I keep looking up. That's where I plot, and it's like an idea board. At the moment, it's called The Frozen River, and it is based on the life and story of a woman named Martha Ballard. She was a midwife in late 1700s Maine. She delivered over 1,000 babies in the course of her career and never lost a mother, which is astonishing because OBGYNs today, many of them can't claim that with all of our modern medicine and technology. She was a legend. But the thing that makes her so fascinating is at a time when most women could neither read nor write, she kept a diary. And she kept this diary for 30 years. And in it is recorded every birth, every death, every murder, every scandal, everything that happened in her small town. In it is also the only written record of a rape trial that changed the legal system in our country. So I have a copy of this diary. It is about that thick, and my computer's sitting on it right now, or I would show it to you. But that is what I'm working on next. And I'm in that stage of writing where it could go either way, like this is going to be awesome, or the worst book ever written.
Well, you certainly have a knack for finding incredible women who led incredible lives to write about. I'm impressed.
Thank you. I have a good nose for it.
I'd like to end by asking what you're currently reading, or if you have any suggestions for the viewers on a book that they should definitely pick up.
So I just finished, because my 13-year-old is desperate to read from some Stephen King. And I love Stephen King, but I feel like 13's a wee bit young, so I kind of have to read ahead of him. So I just finished reading. It's a short story, actually. It's Rita Hayworth and the Shawshank Redemption by Stephen King. If you've seen the movie's phenomenal. It's a lifetime favorite. I don't know that you have fully experienced it unless you've read the book. So that is my most recent finished novel. I'm about to start News of the World by Paulette Giles because I want to see the movie, and I refuse to watch it until I've read the book. And then I am reading one for endorsement. It's called An Unlikely Spy by Rebecca Starford. I just started that one, and so far it is phenomenal. I think it comes out in August.
Well, I want to remind viewers that they can get copies of Codename Hélène from the novel Neighbor. Maybe signed copies. Did you send signed plates?
I'm happy to sign books or book plates or whatever anyone would want me to do.
Well, Ariel, thank you so much for joining me. It's been so fun talking to you and getting to know you and your book a little bit better.
Thank you for having me.